to another episode of The Family Business. I am thrilled to introduce Scott Nelson, CEO of Fastwave Medical. I've been looking forward to talking to him for a while. Scott, thanks so much for making some time.
Yeah, thanks a ton for having me, Matt. Looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, it was an easy ask because as I was talking to you the first time, I kept jotting down notes of things that I wanted to learn more about, as I do in a lot of conversations. But in your case, that became longer than all my other notes. And I said, I got to ask the guy to be on. And so to catch everyone up to the stuff that I know about you, can you take a minute and give some context and like a minute-long snapshot of who you are and what Fastwave is, and then we can get into some of the fun stuff.
Yeah, sure. I'm assuming you don't want me to go line by line on my my resume, right?
Nah.
No, joking aside. We can certainly dive into more details, but at a high level, spent the first half of my career, 11, 12 years, with large strategics, most of them in the cardiovascular space. And then over the past decade now, have made the transition to the world of startups. And first kind of swing at the plate was with a small London-based digital health company called Touch Surgery. They then transitioned their name, I think, to Digital Surgery before exiting to Medtronic. Then I started a company called Juve, which was a very interesting ride. We may have a chance to get into that in a little bit more detail. That was really my first foray outside of the cardiovascular space. We designed and developed class 2 photobiomodulation devices, but maybe the more interesting part about that was we commercialized those entirely online, direct to consumer. And then about 5 years ago, circled back around with some friends of mine in the Minneapolis area to kick the tires on a couple projects, one of which ended up becoming Fastwave. And so almost 5 years, almost 5 years in the making now. And Fastwave is a kind of a classic device startup in the cardiovascular space. We're actually designing and developing intravascular lithotripsy systems, or IVL is the acronym. If you're not familiar with this category, IVL technologies for coronary and peripheral applications. So clinical stage company, venture backed, and very, very close to kicking off some US IDE trials.
Yeah, he's underselling it, folks. Let me give you some context. So from some pretty humble beginnings, I love learning about places that I've never been. I've never been to Iowa. And so what was it like growing up there? And I'm very curious how the acceleration from growing up there to going to school there to all of a sudden becoming this med tech contributor at a significant level.
Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar with Iowa or have never heard of it, it's spelled IOWA. That's how you spell it.
Let me write that down. Hang on.
Iowa. No, it's flyover country, and born and raised there. It's where I met my wife. We've moved quite a few times since then. Are now on the West Coast, but yeah, I consider myself a Midwest guy. Dad was a teacher, mom was a nurse, so grew up kind of in a classic Americana sort of household in central Iowa, actually. And then through my career in the device space, moved to spend a little bit of time in Minnesota, in the med tech hub there in Minneapolis, and then moved out west. Gosh, 9 years ago now. Spent a little bit of time in Southern California, and now closer to the Reno Tahoe area. But yeah, I mean, I don't. We can certainly kind of dive into my upbringing in a little bit more detail. But I think one of the things that's always I've kind of had to manage, I guess, maybe for lack of a better description, over the years, right? Going from kind of green, ambitious kind of, doer earlier in my career to maybe a little bit more refined at this point. But I've kind of carried a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, right? You grew up in flyover country, and always feel like you have a little bit to prove. And so I think I've felt like I've maybe harnessed that a little bit better these days versus maybe 10, 15 years ago earlier in my career. But certainly something that I carry with me to this day.
Look, you've been in all these rooms where you're sitting around with just investors or board members, and half of them have gone Ivy League or Stanford or what have you. And if education comes up, you're like, yeah, I went to school in Iowa, and nothing to be ashamed of at all. But it's interesting how that comes up. So I will ask you one thing about it. So with I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, so I'm a Midwest guy myself to an extent. I mean, there's all kinds of Midwest, I suppose. And when you're sitting in the room and the personalities of the very aggressive East Coasters or the fairly let's call it open-minded folks from California and fairly involved with med tech at an investment level. Have you felt like there's a difference in approach and personality, or do you feel like, nah, people are people and I fit in fine?
Yes and no. I think. I mean, there's certainly a difference. I mean, I don't want to paint too broad of a stroke with a brush here, but yeah, I mean, certainly a difference between people who are kind of west, quote unquote West Coast people versus East Coast people versus Midwest. But I do think at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, people are people, right? You may have to kind of you may have to, maybe work a little bit harder to get through to, an East Coaster, right? Or maybe approach a West Coast person a little bit differently. But yeah, at the end of the day, we both, we we both have to get a certain amount of sleep. We all have to get a certain amount of sleep per day. We all, do the normal thing. So, so yeah, and I think sometimes it's easy to get, or maybe to feel intimidated, right?
Yep.
If you grew up in a state like Iowa, right, with people, other folks that that went to private school in Manhattan, or near Manhattan, or went to an Ivy League school. I think sometimes, I've certainly felt that way earlier in my career, a little bit intimidated, especially in the device space, right? Because if you're at a, you cross paths with so many different people, right, at strategics. A lot of them have really incredible, resumes and pedigrees, and so sometimes it's kind of easy to feel intimidated. But I've kind of learned to zoom out a little bit and approach it maybe a little bit differently at this stage of my career.
One of the things I love about what we do here is because it's global. I talk to people of just about every university on the planet, and I found that at the end of it all, they all like to have dinner. They enjoy weekends. They watch TV. There really is more similarities than differences. So from a med tech standpoint, do you think that your mom being a nurse had some impact on that, or do you think that's just a coincidence?
Oh, undoubtedly. Yeah. I mean, in fact, my undergrad's in biology, and so I was going down the pre-med route,
Okay.
right? Doing everything that a kid at that age would do, right, to prepare for med school. In fact, believe it or not, in both high school and in college, I went to a small little private school in in the kind of the Des Moines area. The last class I took, I had straight A's, right, throughout both high school and college, right, under this guise, I'm going to med school. I need to try to, prepare myself in the best way possible. And the very last class I took, I think I got in both high school and college, I think I got like a B plus or something that ruined my 4.0. But anyway, I say all that because even though I was going down that path, I wouldn't say I was ever truly like sold and bought into going to med school. It was almost like kind of a default, or kind of like maybe the obvious kind of choice, for my, but never really, I would say, truly kind of, like I said, bought in or all in on going down that path. And so took the MCATs, and kind of leading up to my senior year in college, decided to pivot and go a different direction. So interesting enough, right after graduating, I started a boutique little finance company, completely obviously different than biology or the sciences, which I'd kind of spent the prior 4 years studying. And took a little swing there, but had fun learning that business, but didn't necessarily feel totally passionate about it. But to answer, come full circle on your question, my mom was a nurse, and as I was thinking, I mean, this was when I was like in my early 20s, right? And so when I was thinking about different paths to go down, right, throughout the rest of my career, she made a comment. She was like, there's a lot of pharma and device reps, right, that come through. She was in GI, and so that come through a GI suite. Have you ever looked at doing that? And so connected with some people in kind of both worlds, pharma and device, and was certainly attracted to the device space. And so that's sort of what set me down this path.
It's interesting. I would say the vast majority of people that I've spoken to either went to med school or had considered med school or took the MCATs, like in your case, they've discovered, and I wonder if you feel this way, that they've helped thousands of patients as opposed to the one to one that they would have been able to do if they were practicing medicine. And obviously, there's no knock on that. Fantastic that people decide to do that, thankfully. But I'm curious if you feel that way because the impact is substantial when you run a company like the ones you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't. Sometimes it's hard that it's hard to like take a step back and kind of really breathe when you're in the throes of a startup, right? And kind of think about it from that perspective. But But yeah, I mean, others have certainly commented, right? I remember a conversation I had with Dan Hawkins, the founder of
Sure.
Shockwave, right? This was back in that's 2016, maybe something like so, well before their IPO, and kind of at that point in time, I don't think a lot of people had heard about Shockwave, and he made a very similar comment because I think he was pre med. I think he ended up going to business school if I remember correctly, but he made the same comment. He's like, I felt like I could maybe help more people or scale kind of my interests right by going down this device path, and yeah, so I think yeah, I mean, if I stopped and took a breath, maybe I'd probably I'd probably think about that with a little bit more rigor. But undoubtedly, it's incredibly rewarding, right? Because I've got a lot of friends. I'm sure you have a lot of friends that are in other spaces outside of med tech, and especially in the world of doing interesting things from a startup perspective. And oftentimes, I think about the choice I made operating in medtech. It's really hard, right? I like to use the phrase kind of building. It's like playing a game on hard mode, all the time. But I don't know if I could really do anything different. I don't know if I could build another company in a different space because it's so rewarding, right? I mean, anything you do is like directly, in most cases, directly impacting not only a patient's health, but typically, they're dealing with a disease or something that's like, that's having a major impact on their life. And if you can help kind of, solve that to a certain level, or help solve that, or empower physicians to help solve that, that's a pretty cool deal.
I mean, you could do what we do in any industry. There's search and recruiting in everything, but it I've done it just so I'm not speaking off the top of my head here. I've worked in other industries, and there is nowhere near the level of emotional attachment that you get when it's something that's related to somebody's health, somebody's mom, somebody's kid. Someone gets to walk again, someone's gets to exercise again. All these things that motivate you to do what you do. It's extraordinary. And so one of the themes that I wanted to cover in this, because as I'm reading through most of your life, it's the concept of intentionality, like your choices and that you've made, because you've made some big ones. And so if we could go through a couple of them, I'd love to understand, well, was it intentional, or was it serendipity, or a little bit of both? And so in your background, interventional, the vascular space is prevalent. And so is there something personal there? Is it just a coincidence that you decided to make that your area of focus?
Yeah, I don't think that was necessarily intentional per se. In fact, my first kind of entry into the world of devices was with a surgical company,
Oh,
ConMed, actually, like way
okay.
way back in the day. This is like what, 2005 ish timeframe, something like that, 20 years ago now. And so not that that wasn't interesting, right? Because there were some certainly interesting aspects of that. But I then moved from there to Bard Peripheral Vascular, and almost kind of fell in love with the kind of the interventional arena. And so I don't know if that was necessarily intentional per se. It was I think a great opportunity at the time. But what's kind of maybe the more interesting angle about kind of that story is when I spent a little bit of time in the CRM space with Boston Scientific, and even though the world of EP can be like intellectually stimulating, right? I mean, it's if you're kind of naturally curious and like being challenged, that can definitely challenge you. There's no doubt. But it was kind of boring, to be honest. You know what I mean? After you sort of felt like you knew enough to kind of be, start to become dangerous, it was just not overly interesting. And so ended up coming back to I would say the interventional arena, right? And I don't know, it's always been something that's appealing. I also, and I think this is an important point to make. I also really enjoy working with vascular surgeons, interventional cardiologists, et cetera. Not to say that
Why do
I've
you think
worked with
that is?
they especially interventional cardiologists, not to undermine vascular surgeons, but they're pretty ambitious, typically pretty aggressive, usually business savvy, and so
Sounds like you're describing yourself.
but they're fun to be around, and I think that's an important aspect. And what I was going to mention, like, not that I have broad experiences working with ophthalmologists and
Yeah, of course.
orthopedics and whatnot. I don't, but that I think that's an important point, to make, for anyone listening that's kind of thinking about, the device space or their career, is like, do you really actually enjoy working with the people around you, and that's kind of an affirmative, yes for me, which is why I've spent so much time in this space.
Yeah, that's been our experience, that certain specializations or functional doctors are early adopters. And there's a certain level of almost fun with them. They're ready to try whatever it is, and they understand that it may not work in the beginning. And being a startup in that space is great because they're open-minded. Some of the really old school parts of med tech, you bring something new and you can't break in. It's a bit of a boys club, and those are tougher startups to do. And that's why in the interventional space, they're more business savvy. They understand the concept of how we want to do as many cases as safely and as appropriately as we can in a day.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you. We definitely do more than our fair share of interventional and vascular work here, for sure. So continuing this intentionality standpoint, you then leave Medtronic to go to a startup, and then you build your own company, and then you start this. I guess you would call it MedSider. It's a podcasting type of informational platform that we're going to talk about deeply in a minute. But all these choices that you made, I mean, they've led you to this significant career. So let's talk about that a bit. When you were at Medtronic and you decided to kind of make the jump, and what you decided to do with all of that, was all that mapped out, or did you just say, "Look, I need to go try this, and I'm going to figure it out as I go"?
Yeah, I think it was much more the latter,
Yeah.
right? And so, don't get me wrong, I'd love to paint this picture that everything was so strategic, and I was, I had all these different paths kind of mapped out. But I think a theme kind of across my career is probably twofold. One is willing to take a lot of swings, right? Especially if your instinct is kind of telling you to kind of lean in a certain direction. I guess that's one like both points kind of one and phrased a little bit different way, right? Is like, again, willing to try a bunch of different things, especially if you're if you feel like those are the right moves. And so like even going back to jumping to a startup, and just to even kind of take a step back, I'd come into Covidian through their acquisition of a right while they were acquiring and making a couple acquisitions, one of which was Bacchus Vascular, which was a
Sure,
small
I remember.
thrombectomy company.
Uh-huh.
And I've always kind of leaned more towards startups, more towards entrepreneurial kind of activities. And so when the opportunity came up when I was at Medtronic at the time, I was willing to kind of make that leap. And I think at any for someone to kind of have I would say a relatively comfortable kind of position in a large strategic, ultimately you're going to have to make a tough decision if you really want to take a shot at a startup. It's never going to feel easy, and it's never
Yeah.
going to be. I'd say never, but I think in most cases it's never going to be something that you feel incredibly comfortable with or confident in that choice. But I think part of if you're kind of made for a startup, a lot of the decisions you make never feel never feel like that comfortable. And so yeah, and I think those two things kind of are themes throughout a lot of the decisions that I've made throughout my career. But yeah, MedSider being one of them, as well.
Yeah. So to circle back to that for just a second, you're married, you've got 6 children, correct?
Yeah, six. Yeah.
So from a decision, and I always ask this because I'm a family-oriented person, just by nature. But when you make these big decisions, and you and your wife, and even your kids, because they're older now, you sit down and say, "Look, this is what I'm going to do," or is it just, "Look, we trust Scott. Do what you got to do. We're behind you." Like, how do you make those decisions? Because it affects other people besides you.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, but it's probably something that I didn't really truly appreciate until kind of maybe the later stages I say later stages, but kind of more the back half of my career, is how those choices do impact everyone around you, right? Take startups, right? Since we're talking a lot about those, I mean, they are beasts, right? In and of themselves. And so, when you make a decision to join a startup, it's not like you're the only one that's impacted, right? Your wife or your spouse and your kids will probably feel that as well. And so, certainly something that I've maybe just paid more attention to, I would say, especially over the past 5 to 7 years. I've been pretty thoughtful about that aspect. I mean, ask me that same question if we're having this conversation 15, 20 years ago. I probably have been like, no, I'm gonna. It's the best. It's the best move for like we're just gonna go, and do it, without really, kind of thinking about the ramifications of certain decisions. So yeah, I think if I had to kind of zoom out now, I think it's just, again, being a little bit more mindful, a little bit more thoughtful about that, but yet not so I guess methodical in a sense where I'm unafraid to make certain decisions
Well,
either.
you learn how to take things into account, and you still make the right decision for what needs to be done. I mean, you have responsibility to your business and your investors and everyone else involved. So it's not like it's just one party. It's just trying to include everybody in the decision. Eventually, though, you're right. You have to make the call and move forward with it. And most of the time, it sounds like you married a partner and your kids are a part of this, and they understand that this is a impactful thing that you're doing. And
Yeah.
and so it's probably fun for them to be a part of it too, to an extent. You
Oh
know,
yeah, no doubt, no
yeah.
doubt. Yeah, I mean, even thinking about, I mean, a good example of this is when I started Juve. Actually, I mean, that was a classic, side hustle. We had started tinkering and prototyping, just totally on the side. When I say we, it was myself and another business partner, and it slowly kind of gotten that off the ground. And I told myself, kind of heading into this was I think this was 2016, 17 timeframe. Gosh, almost a decade ago now. I told myself, if we hit the magic 83.3K a month in revenue, right? That's $1 million business, right? So like if we hit that, this business deserves a lot more attention. And we hit that a lot faster than I expected. And was it, I think most people maybe would have been a little bit more careful, or a little bit more maybe slower to kind of jump all in. But in retrospect, I'm really, really glad I made the decision at that point in time to go all in on that business, because it deserved a lot more attention, and it allowed us, I think, to grow incredibly fast. So that's a really good example. In some cases, you have to be pretty decisive, and not, it may, again, it's, that decision may feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? But oftentimes, you want to lean into that discomfort.
Well, that's interesting because I was going to say that that is a great example of understanding that opportunity is knocking. I mean, red light therapy was getting popular around that time, and people were starting to look for different ways because everyone wants to live longer, better.
Mm-hmm.
And people who are playing sports or weekend warriors, that red light therapy became this kind of opportunity
Yeah.
to do something to help yourself out. My son's done it and he's used it, and some of my friends who are physicians, they use it for different things. And so it's I don't know. I think it's credit for noticing that I think
Yeah.
I'm onto something, as opposed to feeling the concern and not leaning into it. I give you credit for recognizing what was going on around you at the time, and you maximize the heck out of it. I mean, that's a substantial jump from what you were talking about and what it actually is today.
Yeah, well, and I bring that up because I think, if someone were to kind of look objectively, look at that decision or that move objectively, they would say, well, look, you've got you're kind of moving up within your career in traditional medical device. You've built a pretty big network. Like, you're really going to make a move to, like, consumer health in essence, right? Now, granted, these were class 2 devices, so there's definitely a lot of, like, learnings that I could pull into that type of business from pure play med tech. But some people would have been like, really, that seems like a little bit naive, right, to make that move. I wasn't. It was very interesting, and I'm kind of naturally curious as a person. And to your point, like you just mentioned, it felt like a really significant opportunity. So decided to make the jump.
How hard was it? And I don't know the details of what happened when you decided to go on to other things. Did you turn the keys over to someone else? Are you still on the board? Like, where are you with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it speaks to the importance of making sure that as a founding team you're aligned early on. When you do a startup, and I think it's easy in retrospect to talk about that, but then when you're living and breathing a really, really fast moving company, sometimes you kick that can down the
Yeah.
curve. And so with respect to Juve, we reached a point, because the business is still going, right? We bootstrapped that, never raised money. And as that little business has since done over 100 million in top line revenue, which is pretty wild, and it's still a thriving business. But at the board level, we never had really, I would say, true alignment, right? So I wanted to position that company for a potential liquidity event. because we had done, we had gone from literally from zero to $25 million in top line revenue in 3 years, and was very easy to see a path to 50 plus million within another 18 to 24 months at the time. So I thought it was like we should definitely position this as a for a potential exit or liquidity event. The other part of the board did not see it that way, right? They wanted to continue to run it as, I would say, more of a quote unquote lifestyle business. And as I thought about like my interests, I didn't want to be doing that business for 10, 15, 20 years. That just is not that wasn't me. And so that's what prompted the move to kind of step away back in early 2020. And at that point in time, I took I don't know, it was like a 6 month, 7th month break or something like that. But that allowed me the flexibility to kind of like take a step back and think, what do I want to do next? You know what I mean? So I was fortunate in that regard, and that's ultimately what led to me kind of reconnecting with a lot of engineering friends in the Minneapolis area to start Fastwave.
Yeah, no, I want to dig into the fast wave, but before we do, I don't want to get distracted from MedCider because I find it
Yeah.
fascinating. So, for those of you that don't know, it's just absolutely one of the more informative platforms that I've seen, and I have a soft spot for writing, and sometimes I do it well, sometimes I don't, but I love it. And I was reading several of the things that you've put together, and it's more written to me focused than it is the video piece. And it's the words are exceptionally put together. And so, first of all, do you write all of that? Is that you?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely supported by LLMs these days,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, I mean anyone who reads my stuff is not you're not going to get a sense that it's like it's AI. It's
Yep.
it's written by AI. So yeah. I mean it's myself and a few others that write almost all of that content. But I like you. Like I have a bit of I tend to gravitate towards writing. I think it's really helpful to kind of like clarify your thoughts or your position on a certain topic, and sort of a good output from that, I think is evident kind of where your mind is at, so.
Yeah, I mean, the people you've had on there are some of the iconic luminaries of the space. We've interviewed a lot of the same people, so I was blown away at how many of these you've done and how purposeful they are. Like your intent of the topics you choose and the way that you ask your questions. I mean, it's very well done. And so I don't know if you had any training or experience in this at all, but you're a natural for it. Did you ever do this before? Were you ever involved in interviewing or journalism or anything like this prior?
No, not at all. And so I started getting into podcasting back in 2000, gosh, 2009.
Really? Okay.
A little bit of an OG, and that I think is somewhat related to covering the upper Midwest, right? As in sales and sales management, you get a lot of windshield time, right? A
Hmm.
lot of flying time, and so I gravitated towards podcasts because I kind of got sick and tired of talking heads on the radio, right?
Yep.
Sports talking heads, and so it's like the same old stuff over and over again. And so I got into podcasting, and there was at that point in time, long form podcasting was relatively rare, and podcasting in general was pretty new as a medium, but really found startup podcasts specifically to be quite interesting. However, there is all of them were very focused on, I would say, Silicon Valley tech, right? SaaS, et cetera. And there was nothing for med tech. And I was always, being in the space, I was always like fascinated by this new technology that I saw in a cath lab or in OR, and I was like, where does this come from? Like how is this company built? Where did this technology come from? And so I thought, this is interesting. Why don't I just start a podcast and try to learn learn a little bit more, about these early stage companies. And yeah, it's grown and evolved certainly over time, but I really enjoy it. Right. I mean, it's not something that I really monetize. Certainly selfishly, it's a really good learning experience for me. It helps me build out a better network. And plus
Mhm.
I get the joy of helping others tell their stories, right? Because startups are incredibly hard, like we talked about earlier in med tech. So it's really fun to help other people, raise awareness for what they're building too.
Yeah, we're like-minded on a few things, and this is definitely one of them. Is making sure that people see what's great about medtech because it's so easy to point out the negative stuff in anything. But I always felt, and I'm curious if you feel this way, if we're letting folks know that hey, this startup was able to raise the round that they were shooting for, or they were able to get the regulatory approval or clinical results or whatever it was milestone wise that they were shooting for, just to set a blueprint for the people behind them to say, look, don't give up. There are people who make it. There are 15 to 20% of the startups that make it. Do you feel that way, or is that why you're pushing through it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say earlier on when I started doing those interviews, I didn't maybe think about it in the most mature way. It was more like just kind of tapping into a little bit of a curiosity, a little bit of an itch, selfishly. But since then, yeah, 100%, I'm right there with you. Like it's really really rewarding because um, medtech doesn't get the attention that it deserves, right? Especially in this AI boom, right? And I think fast forward, if we continue to do things the right way, fast forward 5, 10, 15 years, I do think there'll be a lot more attention on medtech, especially as patients, and I say patients, consumers begin to really take much more responsibility over their health. I think this will be an incredibly popular category, right? And that trend, I mean, I saw it firsthand with Juve, right? But I think that trend will only continue. And I mean, I would love to see medtech, become, just as popular, or maybe, getting there or close to it, right, as AI or your next greatest LLM. So yeah, it's incredibly rewarding and fun, really, to kind of help other people tell their stories.
Yeah. As an aside, then I want to get to Fastwave. Is you mentioned something that I read about the concept of having fun and the smiling and being engaging, and it doesn't have to be so serious. You can still have a spirited, intense conversation. It doesn't have to be somber. And I'm the same. I do this family business thing where I talk about family as it relates to people's careers in med tech, and all about different technologies come to the forefront. But at the end of it, I try to keep it light and fun because it humanizes all of this. And I've noticed that you seem to have a similar mindset. So I'm glad that you posted that. I saw that the other day, and I'm like, good. Someone else feels this way. It wasn't just me. So we're like-minded. And so,
Yeah, no doubt.
yeah, it's I don't know. I just don't understand why it has to always be aggressive. Why can't it just be a conversation? But that's just me.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
right there with you. I'm right there with you. And I think actually, med tech kind of as an ecosystem or category, I think we can all do a little bit better in that regard, right? Because that's going to be that much more. It's going to compel others, right, to get into the space. In fact, I had a conversation with it's Gabriel. What's his last name? With
Jones.
yeah, with Proprio. Like
Hmm.
this was a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the same topic of like how do you how do you generate excitement, right, to be able to recruit the best people into your company. And I think that's part of it, right? Like what vibes, to steal the high school's kind of high schoolers kind of terminology, but literally, what vibes are you giving off personally? What vibes is your company giving off? Is it something that's like attractive? Is it magnetic? And I think that will compel more people to kind of pay attention to medtech and get excited about it.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to be excited about. It just takes folks like us to keep shouting from the rooftops. So
No doubt.
so your fast wave, your 5-year overnight success, Fierce 15, and all these other accolades that you were getting, the money that you've raised. I mean, it's been a pretty wild ride for you. And lithotripsy is, to me, one of the more impactful advancements. I mean, look, Shockwave has certainly done a nice job of having a terrific ending for their company, and so I'm sure that that helps with something like this, where you're trying to also enhance the industry. But how much of it was Shockwave based when you first got into lithotripsy? Did you see that technology first, or was that just a coincidence and you weren't really aware of them at the time?
Yeah, no, certainly had been tracking Shockwave's progress, right? Especially considering their IPO in 2019. I mean, you and I both know, like, there's not a lot of med tech IPOs.
Yep.
They're few and far between. But at the time, this was like a mid 2020 timeframe. I don't think there was, I would say, broad consensus on where that company was going, right? Would IVL become a frontline tool within the kind of the broader interventional or cardiovascular space? And I don't think there was a lot of conviction around that. As a founding team, we certainly had conviction that it would become a tool that would be used and adopted with more rigor. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that we had a fair amount of, I would say, domain expertise with respect to to calcium inside an artery, right? And for those that aren't familiar, that's kind of what IVL. That's where IVL shines, right? Is to break up or fracture calcium in an artery. And we had a certain amount of expertise as it relates to not only that disease state, but more so the other therapies that were available, right, to treat that disease state. And they all have some upsides, but a fair amount of downsides, and there's not really a lot of available or I would say compelling tools to treat that disease state. So we were really bullish, or pretty bullish, I would say, on the therapy itself. And we had also been paying attention to CSI's IPR
Yeah.
related efforts as well, and so that was a significant inflection point for us as a kind of a founding team to pursue this project, right, which ultimately became FastWave. Versus others, right? Is when the PTAB kind of overwhelmingly ruled in favor of CSI. But yeah, there's a few inflection points, but I think that's really crucial for any startup, right? Is to hopefully land in a category that's ultimately becomes very very hot, very very attractive to investors, to strategics, et cetera. And timing has so much to do with the startup success. So I'm glad we started FastWave, almost 5 years ago now, because it's been certainly a heavy technical lift to get to where we're at now.
So you had mentioned to me at one point that this is somewhat of a roadmap that you want to emulate or have other people emulate. So let's walk back a step with how this all started and how you think maybe other people can learn from this, or you can learn from it to do it again when you choose to, because it sounds like there's an interesting take here.
Yeah, no doubt. So when one of my co-founders at FastWave is Brady Hatcher, who's the CEO of Switchback Medical. Switchback is a contract manufacturer based in Minneapolis. They've got, I think, close to 200 engineers at this point in time. When we started FastWave, it was a much smaller organization, but Brady he's a mechanical engineer by background, spent his entire career in the device space. Had previously started at another CDMO or contract manufacturer and had sold that. And so really familiar with the space. But I think what's more unique about kind of our story is that in most cases, I guess traditionally you wouldn't build a startup kind of on the backs of, or the chassis of a contract manufacturer, right? Typically that's not, or usually that hasn't gone overly well. I would say there's not a great track record of success. And for FastWave specifically, because Brady is a co-founder of the company and he's got deep experience, obviously, in the contract manufacturing space, we really utilized a lot of Switchback's resources on the design side, right? Because I think it's quite common at any point in a startup's kind of life, you would maybe transition to a contract manufacturer, maybe for the full system or certain aspects of your device, but kind of more so uncommon to really start with design in the earliest stages on kind of the backs of a contract manufacturer. But it worked out extremely well for FastWave because one, Brady and his team were obviously incentivized, right, as founders of the company. And then also, so that naturally creates a much more sort of fluid relationship, right, between startup and the contract manufacturer, which I think is extremely important. And then two, as a kind of a fledgling startup in 2021 and really 22, we were able to really utilize Switchback's resources, right, more so than maybe another startup would. And what I mean by that is there's the goalposts continue to shift back, right, when it comes to venture capital, right, and finding investors that will come into an early stage company in the seed Series A round, sometimes even Series B. And so there's a big hole there. And so the onus on a startup is like, how do you continue to iterate and make progress on your device or your system with not a lot of sort of guaranteed capital around, right? It forces you to become creative, and it forces you to become a lot more nimble and flexible. And that relationship with Switchback certainly helped our case, as we were kind of moving through the early stages at FastWave, because when we'd run up against a technical bottleneck, with one of our IDL systems, we didn't have to recruit 5-10 people to join the team. We could carve out a team, a small, kind of Navy SEAL type of team at Switchback, have them, focus on that bottleneck, right, and make significant progress in a really, really short amount of time, while kind of limiting our burn in the process. So, kind of net, it allowed us to become, it allowed us to stay really, really flexible in those earlier development stages when capital was hard to come by.
Yeah, I mean that's a terrific opportunity to shine the light on CDMOs, and
Mhm.
you find a good one and a strong partner when there are plenty out there. I mean, it's a game changer. There are some that I've heard some horror stories, but there are some that I've heard like what you're describing, where it just accelerates everything that you're doing. So that's an extraordinary suggestion. Now, to touch without geeking out too much on the technology on your device, I know a bit about the space. I've been in it for a long time, and I thought the concept of the 360 degrees of the way that your device works is something worth noting. Is there a way, in somewhat layperson's terms, that you can explain that? Because I think that would make somebody stop, especially the analogy you all use clock for
Mhm.
it, where it was the bottom half of the hour and top half of the hour, as opposed to the entire hour.
Yeah, and before I answer that question, I can just circling back around to the CDMO kind of conversation. I think the other important part that I didn't mention, and as I was kind of rambling on there a little bit, is we thought very hard about how do you effectively scale, right, beyond just kind of this early stage design and early stage development. And I think that's also an important point for any startup, founder or CEO or leadership team that's listening to this is be mindful of that, right? Because at some point you may want to transition. You may have to transition to a different CDMO, right? That can
Yeah.
that's more of a pure play kind of manufacturer, right? And so we thought long and hard about kind of like what that transition would look like, 2-3 years down the road. So I just wanted to kind of mention that, and Switchback gives us a unique opportunity to scale with them, right, from a manufacturing standpoint, or potentially, pivot and bring things in, truly in house, so to speak. And so I think it gives us a lot of optionality, and in most cases in a startup, you want to have options, right? You don't want to get painted into the corner, or painted into a corner, I should say. So yeah, so that was really important. But yeah, to answer your question, Matt, about kind of areas of improvement, right, in comparison to Shockwave. And I always like to caveat this is like Shockwave did a phenomenal job
Yep,
creating a
sure did.
category, right? Tip my cap to their team. I mean, a lot of incredible people there. And anytime you're building a brand new category in med tech, and it's such a huge, such a huge lift. But with that said, it's I would kind of frame up Shockwave's technology as kind of first gen, right? And one of the challenging aspects of med tech is that if you create a category and find success with, I would say, a first gen technology, a lot of times you're kind of stuck with it, right? It may have certain kind of design flaws, right, that you need to improve, but it's kind of hard to do that once you're at commercial scale, especially globally. And so we were, with respect to FastWave, we identified some key areas of improvement, and try to make certain decisions around how to prioritize those. One of which is this idea of circumferential energy delivery, right? If you're listening to this and kind of if you can picture in your head an artery, right, is kind of like a clock in essence, right? The circumference of a clock, and you've got calcium in an artery. Sometimes it's the full 360 degrees of the vessel, right? The calcium is sort of embedded within the wall from 12 o'clock to 11 o'clock, right? That's the circumferential calcium. Other times it's more nodular or eccentric, right? It may be from 12 to 3 o'clock as an example. But the important point is that when you're designing an intravascular lithotripsy system, you want the sonic pressure waves, ideally to deliver true kind of circumferential pressure, right, or true 360-degree pressure. And with Shockwave's design, you don't really get that. You get sort of unintentional directionality, I would say, which is we believe is kind of a design flaw with their system. And so that was one of the key areas of improvement. Probably the single biggest technical lift, right, is to develop a way in which to do that, right, to accomplish this kind of true surround sound type of energy delivery within the vessel, in order to give physicians more of an opportunity to not only treat a broader degree of calcium, but also have more confidence and more predictability, when treating, more eccentric or nodular, calcium. So I know we're getting into the weeds a little bit, but it was
That's okay.
certainly
I wanted
probably
to touch on it.
probably one of the biggest areas of focus that we've had, since day one.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see a startup unfold. And I know you've been there for 5 years, but for people who are coming in late, to just see how it seems like how quickly your company is accelerating with all your clinical works being done, I would highly recommend that people continue to monitor this group and this company. And I am not surprised at all at your level of depth as far as being a human being and professionally because of our conversation prior. So I'm not shocked that this has been a fairly easy conversation in every way. Um, I just want to say thanks for
Yeah.
coming on and making sure that you just continue touting what's great about medtech. It's not falling on deaf ears. I am a fan of the work with the little time that I spent on MedSider, so I'm glad to see that you've been making some time for that in addition to all the other things you've been doing.
No, thank you, and kudos to what you and your team at Mullings Group at Team G does. I mean, like it really truly is. Pretty amazing to watch. I think I came into maybe your ecosystem back in, I don't know, 2019, 20 timeframe, maybe when
Mhm.
you're kind of really kicking off this sort of this media, kind of this new media initiative. But I think it's absolutely critical, right? If that we want to, see more success in med tech, it requires, people like yourself, right? That are raising awareness, right, for these stories and drawing more attention to it. So yeah, kudos to what you guys are doing as well.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I know that sounds cliche, but to me, that's the deal. Well, look,
yeah.
thanks so much for being on. This has been an absolutely informative episode of the Family Business with Scott Nelson, CEO of Fastwave. Thanks so much for being on, Scott.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Matt.
You bet.